The village shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, its red earth paths alive with music, chatter, and the laughter that seemed to define its people. Drums echoed from the central square, children ran barefoot past clay huts, and the scent of roasted maize drifted through the warm air. It was a place where joy was prized above all else, where laughter was seen as strength and silence as grace. But beneath that constant hum of cheer, something less kind stirred in the shadows of daily life. The laughter, bright as it sounded, often carried the sharp edge of cruelty. Among the villagers lived a young woman named Ianda, whose heart was far too tender for a place that mocked tears. She wept easily, not from weakness but from the deep way she felt everything. A bird with a broken wing, an elder's cough, even the tremble of leaves before rain could bring tears to her eyes. Her emotions ran like a river that never stopped flowing, but instead of understanding, people laughed. They called her names softly behind her back, the weeping child, the rain girl. When her tears fell, children imitated her, pretending to sob and then bursting into cruel giggles. Her beauty was quiet, her kindness unshaken, but her softness became the village's favorite joke. Even her laughter, rare and fragile, was met with mockery as if her voice had no right to sound joyful. The market women, proud and loud, rolled their eyes whenever she passed. "A girl who cries at the sight of clouds will never survive a storm," one said. The men nodded, amused, dismissing her as too fragile to be of use, too emotional to be respected. Ianda's tears were never for herself. They were prayers in liquid form, each one carrying something unseen into the soil. When she cried, the earth seemed to hum softly, though no one noticed. Sometimes the air around her grew heavy, and the streams nearby rippled though there was no wind. But the people only saw the surface. They saw a girl who wept too often and decided that such softness deserved ridicule. The village itself thrived on pride, on appearances, wealth, and the loud show of happiness. They mocked sadness as if it were a disease. Yet, behind their walls and painted smiles, there were quarrels, betrayals, and secret fears. They had forgotten the balance between laughter and sorrow, between heart and spirit. And so, Ianda walked among them, a quiet figure with a face like dawn and eyes heavy with empathy. She did not curse them. She did not defend herself. Each time they laughed, she bowed her head and whispered a prayer that the ancestors might teach them compassion. But somewhere deep in the soil beneath her bare feet, something ancient stirred, watching, listening, waiting. For the day would come when one tear, just one, would make the whole village remember what true balance meant. The laughter grew sharper with time, no longer playful or harmless but cruel, a tool to wound. At first it was only whispers when Ianda's tears appeared, but as seasons passed the entire village joined in their mockery. They laughed when her hen died, they laughed when her neighbor's hut burned and she wept for their loss. They even laughed when she cried at weddings, overcome by the beauty of love. It seemed that every emotion that passed through her heart became an excuse for others to humiliate her. At the market, when she saw a hungry child and shared her last piece of bread, her eyes misted. The women around her cackled. "She cries over everything," one sneered, "even when she gives." A man with arms strong from farming threw his head back and said, "Tears are her only harvest." Children imitated her openly now, pretending to sob until their mothers, instead of correcting them, joined in the laughter. The village that once celebrated togetherness had turned Ianda into its entertainment. She began to speak less, not because her voice had lost its power, but because every word was met with ridicule. The sound of her crying became so familiar that people began to seek it, like music they couldn't resist. They would say things they knew would wound her just to watch her break down. "Cry, rain girl," they'd shout, clapping their hands. "Let the ground drink your sorrow again." Each insult was a cut, and though Ianda's tears still came, they began to change. They were no longer simple sadness. They carried weight, a quiet power that seeped into the earth beneath her feet. When her tears touched the soil, it would darken for a moment longer than normal. The villagers never noticed, too consumed by their cruelty to sense that nature itself was beginning to listen. There were times when Ianda tried to hide her pain. She would walk beyond the huts to the edge of the river, where the reeds whispered and the air felt kinder. She would cry there, softly, endlessly, and the river would ripple without wind. Fish rose near the surface, drawn to her sorrow. The air would still, heavy with a quiet reverence. It was as if the world around her understood what humans did not. One day, when an elder in the village died, Ianda wept openly during the burial. The others kept straight faces, proud of their composure, and when they saw her tears, they erupted into laughter. "She cries as if death is new to her," one woman said. "Maybe her tears can wake the old man." Another added mockingly, "Yes, let her flood the grave so he can swim to the afterlife." The laughter rolled like thunder, cruel and hollow. Ayanda's shoulders shook, but she said nothing. Her tears fell into the grave soil, one after another, silent as rain before a storm. The ground drank them eagerly. No one saw the faint shimmer that passed through the earth at that moment, or how the wind grew still, listening. From that day something began to change in the air. The laughter that once rang sweet now carried an uneasy echo, like it bounced off something invisible. The crops near where she cried began to grow strangely lush, yet the villagers ignored the signs. They did not see that their laughter had stopped being merely unkind, it had become a weapon that was turning back toward them. And each drop that fell from Ayanda's eyes was no longer just sorrow, it was memory, grief, and the seed of something ancient that was quietly awakening beneath their feet. The day of the Feast of Plenty arrived, when drums echoed through the valley and smoke from roasting meat curled into the golden sky. The entire village gathered in the central courtyard, dressed in bright cloth and cowrie beads, celebrating another year of good harvest. Laughter rang through the air like songbirds, but not all laughter was kind. Ayanda stood at the edge of the crowd, carrying a woven basket of maize cakes, her simple dress contrasting with the bright garments of others. She had come to serve food and honor the spirits, hoping for peace if only for one day. But even on this day of celebration, peace would not find her. When the village chief raised his calabash to toast the season, someone from the back shouted, "Let the girl of tears bless our feast. Maybe her crying will water next year's crops." The crowd burst into laughter, roaring as they turned to look at her. Ayanda froze. Her fingers tightened around the basket until the edges dug into her palms. The chief chuckled awkwardly, trying to quiet the crowd, but it was too late. A group of young men approached her, grinning. One of them bowed mockingly. "Cry for us, Rain Girl," he said, his tone dripping with cruelty. "Let us see your magic." Another snatched a maize cake from her basket and crushed it under his heel. "Maybe your tears can bring it back," he sneered. The crowd howled. Even some of the women who had once pitied her laughed now, unable to resist the tide of mockery. Ayanda's throat tightened. She wanted to run, to disappear into the forest beyond the huts, but her feet would not move. The laughter surrounded her, rising and falling like waves that pulled her down each time she tried to breathe. Then as her eyes filled, one of the men raised his gourd. "Let's make a game of it. Each tear she sheds we drink to her sorrow." He tipped the gourd high and others followed, chanting her name twisted into cruel rhythm. "Ayanda, Ayanda, the girl who reigns." A single tear slipped down her cheek, landing on the dry earth between her bare feet. The laughter swelled louder, but the moment the tear touched the soil, a faint vibration moved through the ground, subtle yet real. The dust shifted, a ripple like the breath of the earth itself. No one noticed at first except the oldest elder who sat at the edge of the crowd. His hand trembled over his staff as he felt the faint tremor beneath him. His eyes lifted to the sky, then to Ayanda. "The ground hears her," he whispered to himself, unheard in the noise. Near the outer ring of huts, a dog whimpered and tucked its tail. The goats stopped chewing, lifting their heads as if sensing something unseen. Even the birds above went silent, wings stilled in the air for a heartbeat before taking flight toward the forest. But the people laughed on, drunk with cruelty and celebration. Ayanda's tears came faster now, not from weakness, but from something breaking open inside her. With each drop that hit the soil, the tremor deepened slightly, like a heartbeat from deep within the earth. The chief frowned and looked around, uncertain. "Is it thunder?" someone asked, glancing upward. The sky was cloudless, clear as glass. Ayanda turned slowly, her face glistening with tears, her breath unsteady. "You all laugh," she said softly, voice barely above a whisper, "but the earth listens." The laughter faltered for a moment, but only for a moment. Then someone shouted, "She speaks to dirt now," and the courtyard exploded with mockery again. Ayanda lowered her head, clutching the empty basket. The ground beneath her feet felt strangely alive, warm, pulsing. She stepped back quietly, tears still falling, and as she walked away, the faint trembling followed her until she disappeared beyond the torchlight. Long after the laughter faded, the earth kept its memory of that moment, the taste of her tears, the sound of her humiliation. The feast would end in joy, but the ground had already begun to change, storing her sorrow deep within, waiting. Ayanda left the village before dawn, walking barefoot through the tall grass while the sky still held the faint gray of night. Her path was unmarked, no footprints guided her, no farewell followed her steps. Behind her, the village slept, unaware that something sacred had begun to shift the moment she walked away. She carried no bundle, no food. Only the weight of laughter that still rang in her ears, echoing louder than the drumming of her heart. The world around her was vast and quiet. The silence felt like kindness after the cruelty she had endured. She wandered toward the edge of the forest where the river bent like a silver snake, glistening beneath the rising sun. There she knelt by the riverbank, cupping the cool water in her palms. Her reflection shimmered, eyes swollen from weeping, hair tangled, yet there was something in her gaze that no longer seemed broken. The river rippled as if answering her thoughts. She whispered softly, "You do not laugh at me, do you?" The river's current swirled gently, and a soft breeze brushed her face, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant blossoms. 4 days she stayed near the river. She built a small shelter of reeds and branches, slept beneath a sky full of stars, and listened to the chorus of frogs and night insects that filled the darkness. Every morning she would cry, not from sorrow alone but from something deeper, something that wanted to connect with the world around her. Her tears fell into the river, and each time they did, the water shimmered faintly as if infused with light. The trees began to recognize her. When she passed beneath them, their leaves rustled even without wind. Birds followed her movements, perching nearby, their songs softer and more reverent. The wind itself seemed to hum when she breathed. It was as if the world had grown ears to hear her silence. One afternoon, heavy clouds gathered over the forest. The air thickened with the scent of rain, and Ayanda felt an ache rise in her chest. She lifted her face toward the sky, her tears mingling with the first drops that fell. It was as though the heavens were crying with her, each tear a mirror to her sorrow. The rain fell harder, soaking her hair, her dress clinging to her skin. She stood in it, motionless, feeling the sky's grief as her own. But beneath her feet, something ancient stirred. The soil that had tasted her tears before now began to pulse faintly. The roots of trees trembled, drinking in the rain mixed with her sorrow. Beneath the surface, unseen spirits, long forgotten, bound to the land, awoke to her sadness. They were not malicious. They were witnesses, guardians of balance, drawn to her purity of heart and the injustice she had endured. That night, Ayanda sat by her small fire. The rain finally ceased, leaving a silver mist curling above the river. She felt eyes watching her, not human, not animal. The forest had come alive around her in quiet reverence. The wind whispered her name softly, Ayanda. She looked up, startled, but no one was there. Only the trees swaying gently, the river murmuring secrets. She began speaking to the elements as if they were friends. "Do you understand me?" she asked the river. "Do you hear me?" she whispered to the trees. And always there came an answer, not in words but in the shifting of leaves, the ripple of water, the distant roll of thunder that felt like acknowledgement. Days turned into weeks. Her loneliness transformed into something sacred. The world outside her village became her only companion, wild yet kind. And the longer she stayed, the more she felt something building within her. When she cried now, the air would still, the river's flow would slow for a moment, and the ground beneath her seemed to breathe. The spirits whispered through her dreams. They spoke in fragments, echoes of forgotten songs, voices of women who had also been silenced. She did not understand their words at first, only the emotion in them, grief, power, remembrance. She would wake trembling, her cheeks wet with tears not entirely her own. By the time the moon grew full again, Ayanda was no longer the same girl who had fled humiliation. The forest had become her sanctuary, her confessor, her witness. And as she sat by the river one night, watching the stars reflected on its surface, she felt the pulse of something immense beneath her, alive, ancient, waiting. Her tears had ceased to be a sign of weakness. They had become offerings, each drop a seed of something powerful taking root deep in the soil. The earth listened more closely now, and the wind began to carry her sorrow beyond the forest, to the edges of the village that had mocked her, where even laughter would soon begin to sound uneasy. That night, as the moon hung swollen and bright above the forest, Ayanda felt something different in the air, thicker, older, almost breathing beside her. The world had gone still, the kind of stillness that comes before revelation. The wind stopped, the insects silenced, and only the soft murmur of the river remained. She lay on the ground, her head resting against the soil, when sleep came over her like a slow tide. In her dream, she stood in a vast plain of water that stretched as far as her eyes could see. The surface shimmered like glass, reflecting constellations she had never known. She took a step and ripples moved outward, glowing faintly with blue light. From the ripples rose shapes, faces that were neither alive nor dead, their features soft and luminous. They hovered above the water, their eyes ancient and kind. Ayanda, they whispered in unison, their voices like wind moving through reeds. You cry and the earth listens. She wanted to kneel, but her body remained still, as if the water itself held her upright. Her lips parted, trembling. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely a sound. We are the ones beneath the river, one voice answered. We are the tears of those who came before you. The mothers who wept for justice. The daughters who were silenced. The wives who cried beneath the moon. Your sorrow is their echo. The water stirred, and from its depths rose the faint shapes of women, some draped in beads and cloth, some with painted faces, others wrapped in shadow. Their eyes gleamed like small moons. Each time Ayanda blinked, their number grew. The water began to hum softly, vibrating through her feet into her bones. Tears are sacred, they told her. They are not weakness but speech, the language of the earth. When you weep, the ground drinks and the sky listens. Every tear carries the memory of creation. Ayanda felt warmth flow through her chest, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her tears, once mocked and hated, were suddenly holy. She remembered every time she had cried, when her mother died, when the village laughed at her, when she ran into the forest, and she felt each moment return like waves colliding within her heart. But why me? She asked, her voice trembling. Why now? Because you did not harden, the spirit said. You allowed your sorrow to flow. And through you balance will return. The world has forgotten the language of grief, and without grief the land dries, the rivers grow angry and hearts turn cruel. The faces began to fade into mist, their voices growing distant but softer, like a lullaby sung through the rain. Remember this, they said. Your tears carry the memory of justice. When the world mocks what is sacred, remind them what tears can do. The dream dissolved slowly, and Ayanda awoke by the riverbank, her skin glistening with dew. The dawn light filtered through the trees, painting her face in gold. The river whispered beside her, gentle yet knowing. She dipped her fingers into the water, and it rippled in response, as though the spirits had not entirely left her. She felt different now, not lighter but fuller, as though her grief had expanded into something boundless. The voices still echoed faintly in her mind, repeating the truth she could never unhear. Tears are the earth's oldest prayer. From that morning onward, she no longer hid her emotions. When she cried, the trees leaned closer, the air cooled, and the river's current swelled as if joining her in devotion. Her tears no longer fell unnoticed. They were a dialogue, a bridge between the living and the unseen. And deep beneath the soil, the ancestors stirred once more, whispering through the roots and rivers, "Our child has remembered." It happened during the festival of harvest, when laughter rolled across the fields like thunder. The villagers gathered to celebrate abundance, dancing, feasting, and drinking beneath lanterns that swayed in the evening wind. But for Ayanda, the festival was only another trial. Since her return from the forest, whispers had followed her wherever she went. Some said she had gone mad. Others said the spirits had claimed her. Yet none could resist mocking the girl who cried too much. When she walked through the crowd, baskets of fruit in her hands, a group of youths snickered. One of them, the chief's son, proud and cruel, stepped forward with a smile too wide to be kind. "The river's daughter has come," he said mockingly. "Careful everyone, if she starts crying, the food might drown in her tears." Laughter burst from every direction, sharp and loud, echoing against the huts. Ayanda tried to ignore it. She turned to leave, her hands trembling slightly, but another group stopped her path. One of the women, a neighbor who had mocked her since childhood, leaned in and whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "Maybe she should bless our harvest with her tears. Let's see if crying can fill our granaries." The crowd erupted again, cruel and carefree. Someone threw a gourd of water at her feet. The splash drenched her legs, and the chief's son laughed, saying, "There, we saved you the trouble of making your own tears." The laughter grew louder, sharper, almost rhythmic. It rolled like waves crashing into her chest. Something inside her began to unravel, not suddenly but like a thread pulled too long and too tight. She stood frozen, staring at their faces, familiar, ordinary, but filled with ugliness that seemed larger than any of them. Her throat burned. Her eyes filled. And then she began to cry. At first it was silent, just soft drops falling onto the dust. But then, as the laughter continued, her sobs deepened, echoing into something raw, something ancient. Her tears fell faster, heavier, and the air around her began to shift. A strange wind passed through the square, carrying the smell of rain though the sky was clear. The crowd hesitated, their laughter faltering. Someone whispered, "Look at her eyes." Her tears shimmered faintly, glowing with a soft, silver-blue light. The glow reflected on the faces of those closest to her, and suddenly the noise of the village dimmed, as though sound itself was being swallowed. The drummer's hands froze mid-beat. Children stopped in mid-laughter. Even the lanterns swayed slower, their flames bending toward her as if drawn to her sorrow. Ayanda's breath came heavy. She didn't speak, yet the silence that surrounded her felt louder than any voice could be. The ground beneath her feet dampened, the dust turning to dark earth, soaking in her tears. Somewhere in the distance, a dog whimpered and ran away. The chief's son stepped forward uneasily. "Stop this foolishness," he barked, but his voice cracked halfway. Ayanda lifted her face. Her eyes glowed faintly like moonlight through mist. For a moment she seemed not human at all, but something older, something that carried both grief and power. When she blinked, her tears hit the ground once more, and the earth shivered. A faint tremor rippled outward, so subtle it could have been imagined, yet every villager felt it. Bowls rattled. Water jugs tilted. The laughter had died completely now, replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. She whispered, though no one could tell if it was to them or to herself, "You mocked my heart, but the earth has heard every tear." And with that, she turned and walked away, her glowing tears marking a trail behind her. The crowd remained frozen, unable to move or speak. Only when she disappeared into the darkness beyond the huts did the night seem to exhale again. The silence that followed was not peace, it was dread. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances and one elder muttered, "The ground remembers sorrow. And tonight it has tasted hers." From that moment, laughter in the village felt different, hollow, uncertain, and edged with fear. The next morning, the village awoke to an unfamiliar silence. The birds that usually filled the dawn with music were nowhere to be heard. The air was heavy, and a strange stillness clung to every hut. When the first drops of rain began to fall, no one thought much of it. After all, the season of rain was not far. But as hours turned to days, the rain did not stop. It came softly at first, gentle and rhythmic, washing the dust from rooftops and leaving the scent of wet earth in the air. But even that calm rain seemed to carry a strange sadness, as though the sky itself were mourning. The elders noticed it before anyone else, how the wind whispered through the trees, not with its usual hum, but with something like sobbing. Ayanda stayed in her hut, silent, her eyes swollen from tears that refused to end. She felt the rain as if it came from within her, each drop like a heartbeat echoing her pain. The villagers passed her hut warily. Some murmured that she had angered the ancestors. Others claimed she was cursed. Yet none dared to ask forgiveness. Instead, they whispered her name with resentment, pretending not to notice how the water gathered in the paths, flooding their feet. By the third day the rain grew stronger. Thunder rolled across the sky like distant drums, slow and deliberate, as if someone high above was keeping rhythm with her sorrow. The villagers' laughter returned in nervous bursts, hollow attempts to dismiss what they did not understand. "It's just rain," one man said, his voice trembling slightly. "The sky weeps every year." But the old women sitting by the fire shook their heads. "No," one of them murmured, "the sky does not weep like this. This is not the rain of blessing, this is the rain of grief." Despite the signs, the cruelest among the villagers mocked her still. They stood at the edge of her hut one evening, shouting through the pounding rain. "Cry, river girl," one of them jeered. "Your tears call for company. Shall we all drown together?" The laughter that followed was strained, uneasy, but still there, a final act of arrogance in the face of something divine. Ayanda did not answer. Inside, she sat by the small fire that sputtered weakly under the damp air. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling where droplets slipped through cracks, falling in slow rhythm onto the ground before her. She whispered softly, not to them but to the sky, "If they cannot feel sorrow, then let sorrow find them." That night, the rain grew violent. It lashed against the walls, tore through roofs, and sent water rushing through the village's narrow paths. Trees bent under the storm's force. The villagers huddled in fear, whispering prayers to ancestors they had long ignored. But above it all, the sound of the rain became something else, almost like a chorus. 1,000 tiny voices wept together, echoing Ayanda's pain across the land. The heavens, it seemed, had become her reflection, and the world could no longer tell where her tears ended and the storm began. Still, even then, some villagers sneered in defiance, shouting into the roaring storm, "It's just a girl. She cannot break us." But when lightning struck the old baobab at the center of the village, splitting it in half, even the bravest among them fell silent. The rain had no mercy that night. It fell as if the sky itself was crying for her, and soon the earth began to answer. That night, when the rain finally softened, Ianda sat alone beneath the open sky. The air smelled of wet clay and sorrow. The storm had eased, but the clouds hung low and heavy, like dark spirits brooding over the land. Around her, the village lay in uneasy silence. No laughter, no songs, only the dripping of water from broken roofs and the faraway moan of the wind. She felt hollow, emptied of tears, yet the ache inside her refused to fade. She had cried for days, for the cruelty she endured, for the shame that had broken her heart, for the laughter that had mocked her pain. Yet in the quiet after the storm, her grief turned to something deeper, not anger, not vengeance, but a kind of eternal mourning. The moon broke through the clouds, pale and trembling, casting silver light across the flooded paths. Her reflection shimmered in the shallow water pooling around her hut. She saw her face, tired, fragile, and behind her reflection the stars blurred as though the heavens themselves were weeping still. Ianda whispered softly to the night, "If sorrow must have an end, let it be tonight." And then, as if the world itself listened, one final tear slid down her cheek. It was unlike any she had shed before, glowing faintly as though it carried the light of every pain she had endured. The tear hung at her chin for a moment, trembling with the weight of centuries, and when it fell, it struck the ground like a drop of fire. The earth shuddered. At first the sound was soft, a deep, distant rumble beneath the soil, like something ancient awakening. The hut shook. The water in the paths rippled outward in perfect circles. The villagers, startled from restless sleep, rushed out of their homes. They looked toward the sky, but it was not thunder that roared, it was the ground itself, groaning as if in grief. Then came the crack, a sound so loud it split the air. The earth opened near the riverbank, swallowing the path that led to the market. Water surged upward, not from rain but from the depths, dark, cold, unstoppable. Rivers rose where none had flowed before, twisting and turning as if alive, chasing through the streets and around the huts. The villagers screamed. Mothers clutched their children. Men shouted prayers to the ancestors, but their voices drowned beneath the roaring water. One by one torches flickered out, their flames swallowed by the flood. At the center of it all Ianda stood unmoving. The water curled around her feet but did not rise above them. She felt no fear, only the pulse of the earth beneath her, the echo of her last tear spreading through soil and stone. It was not vengeance that stirred the waters but balance, the natural response to a wound too long ignored. Those who had mocked her tried to flee, but the paths they once knew were gone, turned to rivers and whirlpools. The laughter that had once filled the village now rose again, not from joy but from memory. It echoed faintly, twisted by the wind, haunting and hollow. The elders, kneeling in the rising flood, cried out to the heavens, "Spare us! Forgive our blindness." But there was no answer, only the deep, rumbling sorrow of the world itself. The spirits had already spoken and they did not speak twice. One man, the loudest of her tormentors, reached out toward Ianda through the rushing water. "Help us," he cried. "You did this." She looked at him, her eyes calm, her voice soft and distant. "No," she said. "You did." Then, as if her words carried weight beyond sound, the river swallowed him whole. By dawn, the once thriving village was no more. The huts lay buried beneath water and mud. Only the tops of the tallest trees remained visible, their branches reaching out like pleading hands. Birds circled overhead, calling to one another in confused cries, as if mourning the silence below. Ianda stood at the edge of what had been her home. The water stretched endlessly before her, reflecting the pale light of morning. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world had turned into a single endless tear. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes and whispered, "May sorrow sleep now." When the villagers from neighboring lands came days later, they found nothing but a great lake where the village once stood. They said it was as though the earth had swallowed the cruel and left only peace behind. Some claimed to see a figure walking across the surface of the water at night, a woman with eyes like moonlight and tears that glowed beneath her skin. They named the lake, the Eye of Sorrow. And it was said that if anyone mocked the suffering of another, the waters would ripple faintly as if remembering. For one tear, only one, had been enough to remind the world that even the smallest sorrow, when scorned, could drown the proud. When the morning finally came, it brought no dawn chorus, no sound of cattle bells, no crackling of early fires. The world was still, impossibly still. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was not peace. It was silence. A silence so deep that it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. The laughter that had once filled the village, cruel, mocking, careless, was gone. So too were the voices, the quarrels, the songs that had once floated through the trees. Where the village had stood, there was only water now, endless and still, stretching as far as the eye could see. The surface of it shimmered faintly in the morning light, reflecting a sky washed clean by sorrow. The air smelled of rain and mud, but beneath that scent lay something older, a quiet sacredness as though the land had been blessed and cursed at once. The great lake lay in the heart of the valley, calm as glass. Broken branches floated here and there, along with thatched bits of roofs, a carved stool, a basket. They drifted silently, like ghosts of a vanished life. Not even a ripple disturbed the water, except, sometimes, the faint trace of movement that could not be explained. The few who came from neighboring villages stood at the new shoreline, whispering prayers. They could not believe what they saw. The land that had once held laughter and cruelty alike was gone, claimed by the deep. Some knelt and touched the water as though testing if it were real. Others murmured, "This is no flood. This is a grave." As the sun rose higher, its light fell upon the lake and for a moment, it seemed to pulse with color, blues and silvers shifting like the skin of a dream. Then just as quickly, it settled back into its endless calm. Yet as they watched, one of the elders gasped and pointed. There, in the distance was a figure. She moved slowly across the water, not sinking, not swimming, walking. Her shape was faint, blurred by light and mist, but unmistakable. A woman's figure, tall and graceful, her movements steady and unhurried. Her garments, though simple, flowed like part of the water itself, blending with the rippling light. "Do you see her?" one whispered. Another crossed himself in the old way, fingers trembling. "The spirit of sorrow walks," he murmured. No one dared call her name aloud, though all knew who she was. Ayanda. The woman whose tears had awakened the earth. The one mocked for her grief, the one whose pain had been too pure, too deep for the world to bear. They watched in awe as she walked across the surface, her steps leaving no trace. Around her, the air shimmered faintly as though she carried the light of the dawn within her. Her face was calm, neither smiling nor frowning. Her eyes looked far beyond them, perhaps into the realm of spirits, perhaps into the heart of the sky. When she stopped, she raised her hand and touched the air above the water as though tracing a memory. The wind stirred then, soft and mournful. The ripples spread outward from where she stood, touching the farthest edges of the new lake. Birds that had perched silently on the branches now took flight, circling above her in slow, spiraling patterns. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the figure began to fade. The sunlight brightened, the reflection of the sky deepened, and when they blinked, she was gone. Only the water remained, smooth and endless, as though she had stepped into the horizon itself. The elders declared the place sacred. They said it was not destruction that had come upon the village, but cleansing. The spirits took back what was defiled, one said. Her tears washed away cruelty, leaving only truth. Others built small altars along the edge of the lake, offerings of flowers, carved stones and shells. They named it Imanzi Kanlazio, the water of the heart. As the years passed, the story spread far beyond the valley. Travelers came to see the lake that had no river feeding it, no stream leaving it, yet never dried. Some came out of curiosity, some for healing and some in search of forgiveness. They said that when the wind blew gently across the water, you could hear faint echoes, laughter turning into cries then fading into whispers. Many swore they had seen her again. Sometimes at dusk, when the light turned gold and the air was thick with mist, her figure would appear on the far side of the lake, walking as before. Always silent. Always serene. Some claimed her tears still fell into the water, not of pain now but of peace, and that those who truly repented could feel their hearts lighten when they stood there. But others said the silence itself was her warning, that the calm waters hid deep memories, and that if cruelty ever returned to the land, the lake would rise again. The people listened. They began to treat one another with care, speaking softly, remembering that laughter could wound as deeply as knives. Children grew up hearing the story of the woman whose tears became a flood. Their mothers told them, "Never mock pain, for the earth listens. Never scorn tears, for they are the language of life." And when they cried, they whispered into their palms before wiping their faces, "Let my sorrow bring peace, not storm." At night, when the moon shone full and the lake reflected it perfectly, the silence deepened again. It was not an empty silence but one filled with presence, as though Ayanda still watched over it, her spirit walking beneath the stars. Some said that if you stood long enough by the shore and listened with your heart, you could hear her voice, soft as the wind over the water, whispering, "Do not forget." And so the lake remained, not just a grave of a village but a mirror of the soul. A place where sorrow had once broken the world and in doing so had healed it. Years passed and the land around the great lake began to breathe again. Grass grew where once the floodwaters had roared. Trees bent their branches toward the water's edge, whispering to it as though remembering what had happened. Fish filled the depths, birds nested among the reeds, and travelers began to settle nearby, drawn by the beauty of the place. They did not call it cursed, not anymore, but sacred. And so, a new settlement was born on the quiet shore, built by those who had heard the story and carried its lessons in their hearts. The new village was smaller than the one that had been lost, humbler too. The people lived gently, always mindful of their words. When they fetched water from the lake, they spoke soft prayers before dipping their calabashes. No one laughed too loudly, especially when someone wept. The elders had made it law. Tears are not shame, they are the earth's truth. At night, around the fire, the oldest among them told the story again. The story of the woman who wept until the world listened. The children, wide-eyed, leaned closer as the flames danced across their faces. Once, the elders would say, there was a village that mocked a gentle heart. They laughed when she cried. They thought kindness was weakness and sorrow was foolish. But her tears carried the voice of the spirits, and when the ground could bear no more cruelty, it opened and swallowed them whole. The children always asked the same question, "Elder, does the river still remember her?" And the elders would nod slowly, gazing into the dark waters just beyond the firelight. Yes, they would whisper. The river remembers everything. It remembers laughter turned to scorn, hearts hardened by pride, and the sound of a woman's final tear. It remembers and it waits. Sometimes when the moon was full, the villagers claimed to hear faint murmurs drifting from the lake, soft ripples that sounded like whispers. Some said it was the spirits repeating the words of the ancestors. Others believed it was the river itself, humming with memory. One evening, a young boy named Kofi, curious and fearless, skipped a stone across the water and shouted, "If you truly remember, then laugh back." His voice echoed against the hills. The elders who heard him turned pale. That night, as Kofi slept, the lake rose silently, just enough to brush against the steps of his hut. The water never entered, never harmed, it simply touched the wood, leaving behind a faint shimmer that gleamed even after sunrise. When the elders saw it, they bowed their heads. "The river forgives," they said, "but it never forgets." From that day, Kofi carried a small gourd of lake water with him everywhere he went. Whenever someone cried, from pain, joy, or loss, he would pour a few drops into the earth, whispering, "Let it be heard kindly." And in time, others began doing the same. It became tradition. When tears were shed, water from the lake was offered back to the soil, so that sorrow would return to the river in peace, not anger. Seasons turned, generations passed. The story of the drowned village faded into legend, yet the lake remained, calm, deep, and knowing. Travelers who came to the settlement always remarked on how strangely peaceful it felt, how even the children spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. But those who stayed long enough learned the truth. On certain nights, when the stars reflected perfectly on the surface of the water, you could see shapes moving beneath. Not fish, not weeds, but faint outlines of houses, of doorways, of laughter buried in silence. And sometimes, among them, a woman's silhouette drifting through the depths, her head bowed, her hands open as though blessing the world above. The villagers said that was the river remembering, not in vengeance but in wisdom. It carried both the sorrow and the lesson, both the tears and the healing that followed. And so, when a child stumbled and began to cry, no one hushed them. Mothers knelt and wiped the tears gently, whispering, "Let them fall, my child. The earth understands." Fathers would add, "Never mock tears, for they are older than laughter, and the river remembers." In the stillness of the water and the kindness of its people, the spirit of Ayanda lived on. Her story was no longer just a warning, it was a promise that compassion endures, even after cruelty has drowned. The river, vast and eternal, held that promise in its depths, murmuring it softly to all who dared to listen. Every year, when the clouds began to gather and the scent of rain returned to the wind, the villagers prepared for the festival of rain, a sacred ritual born from the story of the woman whose tears changed the world. It was not a celebration of joy alone but of remembrance, humility, and gratitude. The festival marked the time when the heavens wept, not in anger but in renewal, when the earth was reminded that sorrow too could give life. In the weeks leading up to the event, the people cleaned the riverbanks and decorated the village with strands of blue cloth that rippled like streams. The oldest women carried gourds filled with the first water drawn from the lake, their hands trembling with reverence. No one dared to speak too loudly near the water. Laughter was softer, footsteps slower. Children were taught to bow their heads before they fetched water, whispering, "Thank you for remembering us." At sunset on the first day, the entire village gathered near the lake's edge. Drums began to beat, slow, rhythmic, and deep, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the sky. The sound carried over the surface of the water, merging with the wind. The eldest of the storytellers stepped forward, wrapped in a robe dyed the color of tears. She lifted her hands and began to chant the tale passed through generations, the story of the woman who wept when others mocked, whose sorrow called forth the rain that cleansed cruelty from the earth. Her voice wove through the air like mist. As she spoke, others joined in, men and women, children and elders, their voices forming a river of sound that seemed to flow straight into the sky. "May we never mock sorrow," they sang. "May we never laugh at tears. May our hearts stay soft like water, strong like the river that remembers." After the chant, the libation began. One by one, villagers stepped forward carrying bowls of cool water, honey, and crushed petals. They poured these offerings into the lake, each speaking a small prayer. Some asked for forgiveness, others for peace or rain for their crops. Mothers prayed for gentle hearts in their children. Widows whispered thanks for the strength that sorrow had taught them. And every offering made the surface of the water shimmer faintly, as though acknowledging the voices that had come to honor it. As night deepened, torches were lit along the shore, their reflections dancing like fire spirits on the lake. The villagers began to sing the Song of Tears, a haunting melody that only the elders remembered fully. Its words spoke of pain transformed into power, of laughter washed away by mercy, of the sacred bond between grief and growth. The sound filled the air until even the stars seemed to tremble above them. And then, as if summoned by their voices, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady and sure. No one ran for cover. They lifted their faces to the sky, letting the droplets mingle with their own tears, feeling the unity of heaven and earth. The elders said it was her, the spirit of the weeping woman, blessing the people once again, reminding them that compassion was the only path to balance. By dawn, the rain stopped, leaving the world clean and glistening. The villagers walked home quietly, their hearts calm, their spirits renewed. The festival of rain had ended, but its message lingered in every drop of water, every song sung in humility, that no tear is wasted, that sorrow remembered can still heal, and that the woman who once wept alone now wept with the world. Generations passed, and the memory of the drowned village faded beneath new soil and shifting time. Yet the story of the woman who wept, whose single tear had the power to humble the proud, remained. It was no longer just a tale whispered around fires. It had become a lesson carved into the rhythm of life itself. Parents told it to children when they saw cruelty rise in play. Elders invoked it when disputes turned bitter. Even travelers who crossed through the region spoke softly when rain began to fall, for they knew this was the land where sorrow had once spoken louder than laughter. In every village nearby, the story took root differently. Some said she was a spirit sent by the ancestors to test humanity's heart. Others believed she had been an ordinary woman whose pain was so pure that it reached the divine. Yet all agreed on one truth, that compassion and cruelty both leave ripples, and that the world remembers them long after the people are gone. The tale became known as the legend of the sacred tear, a reminder that empathy is stronger than mockery and that no injustice escapes the memory of the earth. During the planting season, farmers poured the first cup of water onto the ground before sowing seeds, murmuring, "For her who wept." They said that without that tear there would be no rain, no balance between sorrow and life. Poets sang of her as the mother of rain, while healers called upon her name when cleansing wounds of both flesh and spirit. Even when new generations doubted the story's truth, they still found themselves speaking softly to the rain, uncertain whether the tears falling from the sky were hers or their own. And so, the legend lived not only in words but in the conscience of the people. It taught them that strength was not always found in laughter, that pain could be holy, and that empathy was the thread that held life together. The river that now covered the old village glistened like a mirror of truth, calm, deep, and eternal. When the wind blew across its surface, it carried whispers, faint but unyielding, like a memory that refused to fade. Those who listened closely said they could still hear her voice, soft and mournful, carried by the ripples of time. It spoke not of vengeance but of remembrance, not of sorrow but of understanding. It said, "Be gentle with the hearts of others, for the earth does not forget the sound of a broken one."